Hello, everyone. Good morning. We'll be starting real soon here. So, everyone, welcome to the check-in for this week. We'll be going over chapter 7. So, again, just a reminder: if we are dropped, if I'm dropped or you're dropped from this session, and you can't get back in it takes more than 5 minutes or so, just look for the recording that will be posted on our Canvas site. Okay, let's go ahead and get started then. Just as a reminder, as by way of our agenda, the purpose of this meeting is to review key information and provide you guys an opportunity to ask some live questions. What we'll be doing today, we'll go over a couple of more reminders. I have a few words I want to say about essays, and then we'll do an overview and summary of Chapter 7, which was the focus this particular week. Also, we'll have another opportunity for some question and answer if you have any questions. Now, as you can see here, using the chat feature, please send to me present so I can use this for some additional points a little bit later in the course when you can get an opportunity to attend these sessions. Okay, before I get started, are there any questions? Do we have any questions out there at this moment before we get started? Okay, great. All right then, so let's go ahead and get going. So just as a reminder, I always like to do this just to remind people about how the course flows. I'm sure you're familiar with it by now since we're going into the next module real soon after the exam for this particular module. We have textbook chapters that we need to read. You have their lecture notes. There's a quiz homework that you can take multiple times to maximize your grade. There's also the video lectures, and a lot of those video lectures now will have a discussion component, or at least a component to say that you did acknowledge that you did view those lectures. So please just be aware to go work through the process. There's a lot of work, it seems sometimes, but if you just try to keep ahead, it will be helpful for you. All right. So a couple of things about essays. I discovered there was a batch of essays, like 3 or 4, that I still needed to grade from the first batch, and I apologize for that. They got misplaced. But most of you should have received by now your essay feedback, and I want to make sure that we cover a few things. I want to go over real quickly what the goals are for these essay assignments. And real quickly, they're are part of the course to help demonstrate your understanding of a lot of the key ideas from the course, as well as research material. Many of you, and I applaud you, many of you do a little bit of additional research, and that's really good as you prepare your essays, and you have to demonstrate your understanding of that material, as well as the material all focused on the topics that we're focused on for a particular unit. Also, communicating complex ideas and concepts related to the history of psychology is, of course, one of the key purposes of these essays, to give you practice communicating about those ideas and concepts, which can be a little bit heady at times. And then, of course, gaining familiarity with producing citations and references for the works, for the lectures, for the other stuff that you've researched. And then a key one is paraphrasing the works of others. One of the things I have noticed in the earlier versions of the essays for this semester, there are a lot of direct quotes, and sometimes they can be a little bit awkward to provide a quote and then put it in the middle of your own writing. So oftentimes I suggest to paraphrase the material and the work of others. So that way you don't have to have a direct quote and deal with all the issues surrounding that. You just learn to paraphrase that work and just provide the proper site. And also I want to remind you, there are sample essay documents on your Canvas site as well that you can look at for a quick review about what some of the things are that you should be presenting in your essay assignments. And of course, there's the rubric as well, and that rubric is online, but also was part of your syllabus. I believe it was the last page of your syllabus. And I use that as a guide when I look over your essay assignments. Okay. Are there any questions about essays before we move on? Okay, cool. All right. So basically then what that takes us to is this particular week. So last week we didn't have the session. I lost a great friend of mine, my laptop computer, and I'm still dealing with that particular loss. And I also lost one of my external hard drives. So I'm trying to piece things together back here, over here. All right. So we didn't cover chapter 6, but we'll be covering chapter 7 this week. And chapter 7 focuses on two individuals, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Okay, and so we'll be talking about these individuals and the times in which they did a lot of their thinking and came up with a lot of their ideas. So first, let's talk about the thing that we've discussed before, and that's the Enlightenment. So we start off talking about this particular chapter by talking about the legacy of the Enlightenment. Now, as you recall, the Enlightenment was a major period in our history where there was a lot of focus on using the works of the scientific revolution, the idea of reason and science, and using that information and those skills in order to address issues of society and government and things of that nature. And the Enlightenment was somewhat contentious in a degree. The Enlightenment the thinkers were very much in the face of those people who were part of the status quo, part of the institution, so to speak, at the time. So they sort of went against the established dogma of the church. So that was the thing. So we saw as part of the Enlightenment a reliance on reason, focus on scientific advancement, building cities, focusing on the development of technologies and things of that nature. So that was what the Enlightenment did for us as a people. But then, not too shortly after that, we have the backlash. And this happens sometimes. Sometimes things that go on in the world sort of go back and forth like a pendulum, swings one way and then it swings the exact opposite way. And that's what we see here. So we have the legacy of the Enlightenment, and now we have the backlash, which was represented by the Romanticism or Romantic period. And so what Romanticism was a widespread movement influencing not just the major thinking of the day, but the visual arts and the music and things of that nature. And as we'll see as we go through some of the individuals who are very much involved with the idea of Romanticism, that their ideas were drastically different than the ideas that were promoted during the period of the Enlightenment. Again, this is a backlash, a response to the Enlightenment was the Romanticism period. So what we see is a major shift in the thinking and what people see as being particularly important. So what we see here, the considered father of this movement of Romanticism is considered Jean Rousseau, and he had many ideas on a variety of different types of topics. But some of the things that he really emphasized were these. Feelings are more important than reason. And so think about what that's saying. We just came out of a section that talked about the Enlightenment, where it was all about reason, rationality, and things of that nature. And now we're seeing major thoughts about feelings being a driving force, and we don't want to neglect feelings, and they can be more important than reason. He also had ideas that humans are innately good, that we are sort of good creatures at heart. And in addition to that, he would also state that society is what turns us bad. So again, remember society, civilization, the big cities, these types of things are part of the societal institutions that can lead us innately good humans astray and turns us bad. So he has a very positive view of humans in their natural state, so to speak, but not necessarily a positive one about society and institutions. He also had ideas, of course, about education. We should take advantage of the natural abilities of the learners. And again, I bring these things up, as I often state, because these philosophers, they were not talking necessarily about psychology, but they were talking about human nature. And as you know by now, a lot of human nature is part of the things that we study in psychology. Why do we do the things that we do? And so when they bring up what they think about humans, it really dictates how they should be studied, how they should be governed, and things of that nature. So Rousseau, a major figure in the development of these romantic ideas. Another individual is Johann Goethe, and he was an individual who was particularly, as I state here, wicked smart, considered a polymath. He had many, many interests, and you would have noted in the text as well as the lecture notes that he was sort of a rock star in a sense during this time frame. He wrote a play called Faust, which was a very, very popular play, and something that was talked about at the time, very popular, and something that people had a great deal of interest in. So he was writing what would be the equivalent of blockbuster movies today back then, and he was that popular. But also he was interested in very much in scientific matters as well. So he wrote about scientific concepts, including offering up ideas about evolution, which we see later did influence Charles Darwin, who we'll talk about in the next unit. So he talked also about things like the inner conflicts of human. He basically said that we go through a lot of stress, and this stress comes from these internal conflicts we have over life and death, good and evil. And of course, these ideas should sound somewhat familiar to you because many of these ideas did influence the works and ideas of Freud. And we'll see more about that when we talk about Freud, I believe also in the next unit. So we see now sort of the stage has been set, why we have Romanticism, a backlash to the Enlightenment, someone whose ideas were considered to be the initial start of that movement, the father of that movement, Jean Rousseau. And then we see a person that sort of represents the best of that era, so to speak, Johann Goethe, who was a very well-rounded individual who had a great deal of influence, not only in the world of entertainment back in the day, but also in scientific areas, including psychology. So that sort of sets the stage. And now we talk about one of the key figures of this particular chapter, and that is author Schopenhauer. And hopefully you did see the video. There's at least one video, I believe, that was suggested that you review on Schopenhauer. And usually people take that video as kind of trippy because he really comes across as a major pessimist. He sees oftentimes is sort of sees the glass as half empty type of individual. So he's generally thought of as a pessimist for a lot of the ideas that he promoted. He comes up with this notion as that there's a driving force that we all possess, sort of a will to survive, a will to live, a will to life. And this driving basic motivational force is almost overpowering to us. And so we are always seeking some sort of fulfillment when it comes to our emotional state, our physical state, sexual desires. But one of the things that he emphasizes is that even though we have this ongoing search for these things, we never truly meet them. We never fulfill them. It's never really achieved. So we have this ongoing desire cycle that we go through. And so he paints a picture of somewhat of a bleak existence. He sort of promotes the idea too that we should try to negate these desires and sort of live sort of like a monkish lifestyle. Now, one of the key things that we see that Schopenhauer, as well as we'll see later Nietzsche, promotes is this idea of irrationality. Now, again, irrationality is very contradictory to the whole idea that we saw during the period of the Enlightenment. So here we see that this is a key idea that they're offering to us here. So Schopenhauer notes that we are irrational creatures driven by our desires, primarily this will to live, will to life, where we have all these things driving our behavior to procreate, to get into relationships. And what he emphasizes is as this drives our desires, it makes us not so smart. We don't think clearly. Therefore, we can do things that if we were maintaining control of our faculties to some extent, we would never do. So I think it comes across really well in the video that is done about Schopenhauer, where he talks about how our behavior sometimes is not always the wisest thing that we do as we try to meet this will, these desires and desires that we never really fully meet. So in addition to that, he proposes the idea that there's a lot of suffering going on, and part of the suffering that we have is because we have to deal with other people. Okay, and other people are the source of a lot of our pains and agony. And so he offers the idea that people who are highly intelligent, they probably suffer the most for it because they sort of know what's going on. They know what the world is like, and they suffer. And so in order to avoid their suffering, they will seek solitude to try to be with themselves and with their own thoughts. And also a benefit of that, as well as being able to avoid people who are not their intellectual equals or their inferiors, people who are less smart, so to speak. So we see not only this general idea of pessimism, but also this notion of a little bit of elitism to a degree as well that he sort of offers up. So you can see this idea of his that he is a pessimist to a large degree is really emphasized too by how he states what we do in life. He sees life is not about enjoyment or being happy. It's just seen primarily as a postponement of death. And he says, this is why we cling to life, not because life is so fun and happy and all this type of stuff, but simply because we fear death. And that's the basic ideas that Schopenhauer sort of offers to us. And obviously, it's sort of crazy to some extent, but some people can sort of relate to it. I'll pause there because I'm talking really fast here. I'll pause there to see if you have any comments on any of this or any questions. I'm sure you've seen the video on author Schopenhauer as well. So I'll pause and see if you have any comments or questions. Well, you could even say no comment or question if you don't want to.
No comment or question.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so basically with Schopenhauer, he sets that stage of what the Romanticists were really preaching to a large extent by way of being totally the opposite of the types of individuals and philosophies that we saw during the Enlightenment era. Okay, so we see again this idea that Freud is going to be a major factor here, that we see these individuals are influencing him. Now we also see it with the idea of existentialism. Now let's go into a little bit of idea about the background of existentialism. We have talked about in several occasions already about the role of the church in people's lives. And it was very influential. It was a major player. They dictated a lot as to what went on and had a great deal of influence over people's lives. So the background that sort of would lead to this idea of existentialism first goes back to the idea of the church's influence. Now, the church's influence began to become lessened. They weren't as influential as they once were. Remember, there were many fights that we saw previously in previous lectures as scientists and philosophers went against the church. And again, we have the Enlightenment era where we have philosophers and scientists even targeting the church to a degree when it comes to their dogma and how they saw the world working. And so a lot of the shine, so to speak, was being taken away from the church, and the church's role in day-to-day life was not as significant. So the church, again, normally would provide direction and purpose for one's existence. So the notion would be, when someone would go and talk to the priest or local church member, why am I here? They would be easily be able to tell them, this is why you're here on this planet. You're here to do this. This is the reason for your existence, and things of that nature. And so as the church lost a little bit of its influential power, and as the world became more secular or less church or religion focused, we saw people having more difficulty trying to cope with the craziness of the world, and are feeling much more alone without the guidance of the church. I'm going to pause there. I'm going to ask someone to respond to that, please. Does that make sense, this idea of what the church's role was then?
Yes.
You want to elaborate on that at all?
Sure. So I think that the church was just really powerful because a lot of people didn't really have education, and it was just kind of the main rule of life. Like, you go to church, they tell you what to do. They kind of govern your thoughts. So I feel like maybe that's why some people started kind of having their own ideas, because after so much time of being told how to think, they kind of wanted to separate and bring their own ideas forth. Not
Right.
sure.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, because remember, at this time, you could almost consider the church as being CNN, Fox News, your source of all information, also a way that you can get education. So the church was a very significant player in the lives of people back then. And so when they would state something, people would fully accept it as this is the way things are. So when the church started to lose some of that power, some of that influence, then people, the normal people, so to speak, were more apt to get lost. But the idea is that this is a key notion as to why it is that some people, even though they may disagree with church or church-focused religion, they always state, or some would state, that they saw the need for it. Even Nietzsche would say he saw the need for it, even though he was very much anti-Christian to a degree. So the notion is that the church served a role. And now, as the Enlightenment period demonstrated and other things demonstrated, the role was much less now. So the notion is that the church, as someone pointed out here, the church was one way for people to be told about the Bible, because the average person could not understand or could not read it because they may be illiterate. But the notion is that the church serves so much the day-to-day life of individuals that they could really control how people thought, what they would think about themselves, why they would have this many children, or what have you. So now you have this major force that's not as powerful anymore, and not telling you to do things that they used to tell you to do. And all of a sudden you're feeling lost. You don't have anybody sort of directing you as they once did. Now, the idea is that when this happens, people can sort of feel like isolated and alone, that they don't have the ability to cope with things. And we'll see a little bit more of this when we get to Nietzsche a little bit from now. So we see this is the background. So this is the way the world is. And existentialism, what they really stressed was the meaning of human existence. Why are we here? And freedom of choice, your right and your ability to make your own choices about things, and your uniqueness of the individual, that you are, why you're here, you can choose, and you are a unique individual, sort of demonstrating to some extent the idea of your worth. So the individual who's considered to be the first existentialist, so to speak, is Soren Kierkegaard. I think he was Danish. Soren Kierkegaard, the first existentialist, and his ideas. Again, we see that religion is always sort of like a major component to a lot of these notions because, again, when it comes to existence, uh, the big guy, God, is a key factor there. So what Kierkegaard stressed, he sought to find and suggested to people to have a personal relationship with God without the church. So he was not a proponent with the idea to get behind the church as an institution, but to go directly to have a personal relationship with God. And that is something too that we see from time to time during this era as well, is that people were talking about bypassing the church structure and all this type of stuff and developing that relationship with God directly. Now, one of the other, we'll get back to God in a second when it comes to Kierkegaard, but one of the other things that he talks about that was somewhat interesting, I thought, was this idea of truth. And he emphasizes that truth is subjective. Truth is something that must be experienced, that you cannot have truth taught to you. And so in a way, what this tends to suggest, and we can see this even going on today in our world, is that truth means different things to different people. One person's truth may not be another person's truth. And we'll see this pop up a time or two, the idea with a lot of the philosophers that truth really is not something that many would think of as being objective. My crazy cat. All right. And so the notion is that the truth is subjective and it cannot be taught. I'm going to pause there and see if anyone has any thoughts about that. You can either chat it and send it to me through a text message here or speak up. What do you think about the idea of truth is subjective?
I feel that maybe the truth is subjective because everyone has different upbringings. So it goes back to kind of the nature versus nurture kind of situation. So maybe you were taught that, truth is, a specific thing. And maybe other people were taught, well, it's okay to lie sometimes. So I think it just kind of goes back to what you're exposed to and then perception. A lot of, what you feel is right, what you feel is wrong. So maybe that's kind of what it is.
Yeah, definitely when it comes to perception, I see that as well, is that you can have two individuals observe a video clip of, let's say, a speech or some event, and they totally have different ideas of what they just saw. Okay.
So I was actually going to say the truth is based off of your perspective, a person's perception, their feeling or opinion. Right. That's why I believe is more subjective than objective.
Yeah, and agreed. The idea to some extent is going to be this thing that we call truth. We think of it sometime as some sort of big thing that we can find, like they say, the truth is out there. But the idea is that no matter what you do, when we're talking about humans at least, no matter what you do, the truth will have to be interpreted by whoever is doing the perceiving. And that becomes the reality, and that becomes that person's truth. So that's one of the reasons that sometimes I believe that there are going to be times where it's going to be very difficult for people to come to terms with certain things because they are experiencing different truths. It's almost like this idea that we talked about previously with Kuhn, incommensurability, that their paradigms are so different about the world that it's hard to even compare them, and therefore they can never come to this idea of this truth anymore. Now, a little bit later, someone just texted here about blind faith and things of that nature. We'll see a little bit more about that when it comes to Nietzsche, because he suggests something too that some people have talked about, maybe is going on right now, is that a lot of this stuff where we've sort of lost our connection with the church by way of them telling us what to do, at least, and we're sort of out there by ourselves, we're not fully prepared for dealing with the world in a certain way. So we'll get there in a second. But those are the ideas that he sort of set the stage for about this idea of truth. And we will revisit this notion of truth a little bit later in this course as well. So moving on, talking about this next slide here talks more about Kierkegaard, and he talks about the notion of freedom, because one of the key things that they talk about as part of the existentialist ideas is that you have choice. Okay, so it's human existence, the meaning of it, your freedom of choice, and your uniqueness of the individual. And so what Kierkegaard basically says is this: your personal freedom occurs in stages. In the aesthetic stage, you do not recognize your ability to choose. So you don't even know that you have choice, okay? And then the ethical stage, you accept responsibility for choices that you make, but they're greatly influenced by the principles established by others. And then in the religious stage, he talks about you now accept that there is freedom and you have a personal relationship with God. And so he sees this as sort of like the ultimate, where you have established this thing that he says we should be seeking, the relationship with God, and we understand and we accept that we have our freedom to make these choices. So this is one of the key things. Now, I noted here in the video lecture from earlier, as well as here in the notes, that this is sort of suggests that individuals here can be somewhat nonconformist. Okay, so here that means they can sort of go against what other people believe or say and things of that nature. And I always thought this was very similar to the post-conventional moral stage that Kohlberg offered up. And some of you may remember Kohlberg and his moral stages of development. He has the pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. And post-conventional, it was the idea that you have ethical principles and you're right and wrong. Well, first let me go through the earlier stage. The pre-conventional stage is you think right and wrong is based on whether or not you'll get rewarded or punished for it. That's a kid. Usually younger than 9 years old. Right and wrong is based on whether or not you get punished for it or rewarded for it. And then you go through the conventional stage. It's about order, trying to remove chaos. You follow the rules, you know, like young adolescents, they say, well, that's not the rule of the game. They're all about the rules. And then in post-conventional stage, it's about higher ethical principles. And sometimes with that particular stage, you can go against laws if you think the laws are unjust. So I always saw this religious stage here, the nonconformists that are talked about here, as being somewhat related to that idea of post-conventional stage of morality offered up by Kohlberg. So that sort of sets the idea of existentialism from the way of Kierkegaard, who was considered that first existentialist, and what his ideas were about that. All right, so the next thing I want to cover here is Friedrich Nietzsche, okay, and Nietzsche. First of all, very controversial individual, and one of the reasons he's very controversial is because of this statement he says here, God is dead, we killed him, that type of thing. So why did he say God is dead? Why did he say that? Well, let's think about it this way. We've gone over a couple of things already in this course. You know, we've had philosophers and scientists have their run-ins with the church. Some of them were even put on trial for heresy and things of that nature. But what he says is this: philosophy and science both have led to more secular views. And what that means is this: they have sort of demystified the specialness of human beings. Remember, the geocentric versus the heliocentric models that we talked about previously. The geocentric basically said that the Earth is the center of the universe. If you're the center of the universe, are you special? Yes, you are. But now we see scientists say, well, we're not the center of the universe, so we're not so special after all. And then we see with the earlier philosophers and scientists as well, even with Rene Descartes, that human biology and animal biology aren't that different, that we're both based on mechanical principles, and we're to larger or smaller degrees of complexity. And so the notion here is that we see the specialness is sort of being dusted off of us. And so what this is basically saying is we, philosophers and scientists, over years have sort of taken things away from the idea of the specialness of human beings. So this resulted in, one, humans are not so special. And it also, from his perspective, led to people having convictions on things based on their opinions and feelings, maybe, that can lead to fanaticism, meaning that people have their own truth, and even though people may have rational ideas against that particular truth, they won't listen to them, okay? Because to them, this conviction has turned into a fanaticism. Does that make sense? Okay, all right, so the notion here is that what he's basically suggesting, Nietzsche, this was a long while back, is that these actions of philosophy and science over the many centuries here have sort of taken that little shine off of us. This also results in his opinion too, is that this is my phrase here, we are wishy-washy, okay, very scientific term, wishy-washy, meaning that we are now a people who can be somewhat easily influenced or led. Now, does that make sense? And I'm going to ask you to respond to that, at least a couple of you at least. Do you think as a people, we could take any country or us or whatever, that people are easily led from time to time? Okay, I can see lots. Yes. Yes. Okay. All right. So basically, we do see that the feeling that you guys are chatting to me about is that is true, and we can see this all around the world. And again, if you're one of the individuals, I avoid just about all news these days for the most part. It's just very depressing to me. But if you're one of those individuals that can see what's going on, and you see people who behave in certain ways for this cause or that cause, and you say, I don't understand it, to a large degree, it could simply be, as Nietzsche pointed out a long time ago, is that we are easily led, easily influenced, because we don't have a grounded center, so to speak. So the notion is, and someone points out the idea about conformity, and that's part of it as well, is that we are easily going to conform. We sort of go sometimes with the herd mentality, but we have to figure out what herd we're going to associate with, I guess, what it comes down to. So what we see here then is this is what he was behind the statement of God is dead, is that basically it's more of an idea that we sort of demystify things about our specialness in the universe. And because of that, we sort of lost our anchor. Think about it this way. I'm a big time sci-fi guy. And I read stories sometimes about this idea. What would happen if tomorrow's Saturday, if Saturday, all of a sudden spaceships, not our spaceships, but spaceships, alien spaceships came to this planet? Would there be a crisis of where we are, where we fit in the universe? Would you question things? Yes, most likely you would. It would be a major type of thing. So they would leave, okay, yeah. But the idea is that, yes, these things would be phenomenal questions and cause all sorts of issues as to where our place actually is in the universe. So this notion of losing, quote, God here is why he thought it was very important. If you see the video on Nietzsche, and you should have by now, I'm sure, on Friedrich Nietzsche, that he has a lot of things to say about Christianity, but he also points out in that particular video as well that he sees that there is a need, and there was a need for a church, okay, and for the reasons that we stated earlier about it sort of gave people an anchor to some extent. So one of the key things that Nietzsche had a problem with in Western philosophy was this, that all of a sudden, and we saw this in the Enlightenment period as well, that intellect was seen as more important than passions and emotions and things of that nature. Now, going all the way back to the start of the Romanticism period here, where Rousseau basically said feelings over rationality, or things of that nature. That's the totally opposite of the ideas of enlightenment. But so we see Nietzsche's agreeing with this, is that the intellect should not be over the passions, because what he basically said that did is it led to a life of lifeless rationalism, that we became somewhat bland. So one of the key ideas that Nietzsche proposes, that we need to seek some sort of fusion between our rational self and our irrational self. And he too, very much like Schopenhauer, states that we do have this irrational side of ourselves. We have this irrational aspect, and we cannot ignore it. We don't need to ignore it. We need to find some way to fuse it together with our rational side, because if not, then we are losing a good portion of ourselves. So again, remember, this backlash to enlightenment, they are just basically saying we need to embrace our feelings, embrace our passions. And again, something that would be totally opposite of what we saw during the Enlightenment phase. All right. And then we have, as we wrap things up with Nietzsche here, he has the will to power. We saw previously with Schopenhauer is the will to live, the will to life, will to survive, whatever you want to call it. That was his driving, motivating factor. Here, what we see is the will to power. And what he meant by the will to power was simply control. People want control over themselves and over their future. This is the driving force, this will to power. And let's be honest, to some extent, that has to be the case. We know that. And in fact, part of the reason that you're in this class, part of the reason that you're trying to get your degree, or for some of you, an additional degree, the idea is simply that you want to have some better control over your future, or you want to push yourself to get the most education and the more degrees behind you that you possibly can. So this will to power, he sees as a driving force behind us. Now, one of the other ideas that he offered up to us was this idea of the supermen. And the supermen were these individuals who could reach their full potential because they were not hindered by standard morality to govern their lives. Now, when I see this, I always think about other ideas of reaching our full potential. For example, we have the similar idea in self-actualization with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you optimize yourself, become the best person, the best version of yourself that you can be. Here, we're talking about similar idea, but one of the things that he adds to it is that these supermen, these outstanding individuals, they don't operate by the standard morality that governs the lives of other folk. And because of that, they can achieve more. All right. Now, obviously, also when I hear Superman, sometimes I think of sociopaths. Let me explain that. Sociopaths are individuals who have a different view. You know, they can do things that most people can't do. For example, let's say someone is a vice president of some company, and he's going to sign a document later this afternoon that's going to kick 5,000 people out of their homes. Okay, some people would have some really bad vibes about that, and they probably couldn't do that. And those individuals probably wouldn't be in that type of job. But people who can do that, they don't have a problem with that. And I'm not saying these guys are sociopaths, but there are certain sociopathic tendencies where you're not going to be influenced or affected by that as much, and you're able to do those types of things. So basically, these individuals tend to live by a different code, so to speak. And so the idea of the Superman was used by the Nazi Party when they rose to power in Germany, and the idea that they were promoting the notion that the German people were the Superman, and therefore they would do whatever would be necessary because they operated by a different standard of morality. So what we've done there is we've sort of covered the key points and highlights of why the Romanticism period came about as a reaction primarily to the Enlightenment, and the two versions of things that happened around that time and led to, we had the Romanticism of Schopenhauer, and then we had existentialist ideas that had to deal with the reason as to why we exist and find out some way for people to cope with that so they can make choices about their life and revel in their uniqueness as individuals. And as some stated, like Kierkegaard, to find some sort of personal relationship with the all-powerful God. So the idea is these things sort of set the stage for other things that we'll be talking about a little bit later in the course. So I'll pause there to see if you have any questions or comments about any of the things that we've just covered, and just to go ahead and communicate the following idea that we will be finishing up this particular unit. The test is available to you now along with a study guide for the test, and the next unit will be opening, I think Monday, which will be the time frame for you to finish your exam number 2, and the next unit that we start will start the section finally on psychology. So this is the start of the psychology section. We'll be talking about psychophysics and physiological psychology, followed by evolution in psychology, and then we'll get to our buddy Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis, and then we'll start off with the formal start of the discipline of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt and the birth of experimental psychology. So I'll pause there, see if you guys have any questions or comments. If not, I'll let you guys start to wrap things up. Any comments or questions?
I do have a quick question. It has to do with the idea of the Superman.
Okay.
I didn't know if with the idea of the Superman, he was saying that it was people that reached their full potential. But I also kind of noticed that the people that were able to reach their full potential and like get an education were people that had money, and they were able to dedicate that time to actually get an education and like kind of pursue their interest, whereas like a regular common person back in the day would be worried about, man, I have to survive, I have to go feed my family, find a way to kind of, you know, worry about other things. So did they mean the idea of the Superman as just a person that was kind of had different morals, or
Yeah.
also had
I'll put it this way, is that a Superman, taken into how I understand it and how I think it was communicated, would be this. They will remember, they don't operate on the same moral standards as normal folks. Does that make sense? Okay, because they don't operate the same moral standards, they have a little bit more flexibility as to what they can do in order to make themselves successful. Does anybody have a statement on that? You know what I'm talking about? I mean, we see similar types of things too. Basically, it would almost suggest that an individual who's a Superman could be somebody who grows up in some horrible neighborhood somewhere, and they rise to power and become someone of power and influence through some sort of criminal means, potentially. Okay, now I'm not as well read up on the idea of the Superman as he communicated it, but initially it does seem that the notion is that we do not have to follow those same moral standards. In fact, I think in the video segment that you guys have available to you is that they make that point that the Superman, why would you think that these individuals who are trying to achieve this would follow the same rules as other people? So in a way, you have people who are just going to go along to do whatever, and then you're going to have those people who will strive to do whatever it is to achieve. And those, I believe, are going to be the individuals they see as the Superman. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Anyone else? Okay, well, I will let you guys get out of here. Be sure to review the study guide prior to taking the exam. It'll give you some pointers and ideas and some of the things to focus on. If there's nothing else, you guys are free to get out of here. I'll talk to you guys later. Take care.